Ready to die, old man. The words, sharp and serrated with youthful arrogance, cut through the oppressive Mojave heat. The crowd of young Marines, their faces a mixture of bravado and sun-baked exhaustion, chuckled. They stood in a loose semicircle on the bleached white concrete of the advanced training facility, a place designed to break men and forge warriors. The man at the center of their derision, the target of the insult, did not flinch. He did not look up. He did not acknowledge the challenge hanging in the dusty air. His name was Master Chief Petty Officer Elias Thorne, on temporary assignment from Naval Special Warfare Command as an observer, and to the eyes of Gunnery Sergeant Miller, he was an anachronism, a relic. Miller, all chiseled jaw and booming parade ground voice, saw a man past his prime. He saw the faint web of lines around eyes that had seen too much sun, the flecks of gray, dusting temples beneath a faded boonie hat, the slightly stooped posture of a man who had carried heavy things for a very long time. He saw the gear, a slightly worn plate carrier, a rifle that wasn't the latest SOCOM-issued model, boots scuffed with the dust of a dozen forgotten countries. It was all evidence, in Miller's mind, of a man who had been left behind by the relentless march of modern warfare. Thorne's silence was his most infuriating quality. It was a vacuum into which Miller poured all his assumptions. He continued his methodical task, his hands moving with an unhurried, practiced grace that was a stark contrast to the jittery energy of the younger men around him. He was loading a magazine, seating each 556 millimeters round with a firm, precise push of his thumb. Click! The sound was small, insignificant against the vast, indifferent desert. Click! It was a quiet testament to a process, a ritual performed countless times in the bellies of helicopters, in the cramped confines of submarines, in the suffocating darkness before a dawn raid. Each click was a prayer to precision. From the observation tower high above the range, Marine Colonel Vance watched through a pair of high-powered binoculars. He wasn't focused on Miller's preening display of authority. He was focused on the old man's hands. He saw the economy of motion. He saw the absolute lack of any wasted energy. And he saw something else, a ghost of a memory from a classified briefing nearly a decade ago, a grainy satellite photo of a man moving with that same impossible efficiency through the rubble of a fallen city. Vance lowered the binoculars, a knot of intrigue tightening in his gut. Down below, the quiet man finished loading his magazine, inserted it into his rifle with a solid, satisfying clack, and finally, slowly, raised his eyes to meet Miller's condescending smirk. He said nothing. The silence was his answer. It was a silence that held the weight of 1,000 missions, a silence far louder than any boast. The young Marines shifted, the laughter dying in their throats. They sensed, without understanding why, that a line had been crossed. They had mistaken stillness for weakness. They had mistaken silence for fear. And the desert, ancient and patient, waited to teach them the difference. If you believe true strength needs no announcement, type quiet professional below. Gunnery Sergeant Miller was a man who thrived on noise. He believed leadership was a function of volume, that respect was commanded through booming declarations and public corrections. Thorne's profound, unshakable quiet was therefore not just an annoyance. It was a personal affront, a rejection of Miller's entire worldview. Goaded by the unnerving calm of the older man, he doubled down, determined to break that composure and expose the fraud he perceived. "What's the matter, Master Chief? Cat got your tongue?" he barked, stepping closer, invading Thorne's personal space. "Or did they not teach you how to speak in the old-timers' Navy?" He gestured dismissively at Thorne's rifle. "What is that, a museum piece? We're running monolithic uppers, free-floating barrels, variable power optics. That thing looks like it was used to storm the beaches of Normandy." The Marines snickered again, more nervously this time. They were caught in the gravitational pull of their gunny's authority, their own insecurities compelling them to align with the perceived strength in the room. They saw what Miller told them to see, an old man out of his depth. They failed to notice the details that would have screamed a different story to a more experienced eye. They didn't see that the outdated rifle had a perfectly worn pistol grip, molded by thousands of hours of handling into a custom fit for its owner's hand. They didn't see that the finish on the receiver was worn away in the exact spots that indicated a perfect, consistent firing posture. They didn't see the quiet intensity in Thorne's eyes, the look of a master craftsman assessing a familiar tool. Thorne simply continued his preparation, his focus absolute. He performed a press check, his fingers moving with surgical precision, confirming a round in the chamber. He adjusted a sling, not with a frantic pull, but with a slow, deliberate tightening that was part of a larger, invisible system of movement. Miller, seeing he was getting no verbal reaction, decided to force the issue. He would humiliate the man through action. "All right, ladies," he shouted to the assembled squad, his voice dripping with condescending theatricality. "Since the Navy has graced us with its historical presence, we're going to let the Master Chief here demonstrate a run through the Serpent's Tooth." A murmur went through the Marines. The Serpent's Tooth was the facility's apex predator, a multi-level close-quarters combat course renowned for its complex angles, devious target placements, and punishing time limits. It was a monster that had humbled even seasoned force recon operators. The record, a blistering 483 seconds, was held by a legendary Marine who was now an instructor at Quantico. "The rules are simple, old man," Miller sneered, looking directly at Thorne. "Clear all hostile targets. Avoid the no-shoots. We'll see if you can even finish before the sun goes down." He was framing it not as a test, but as an inevitable failure, a public execution of a reputation that, in Miller's mind, did not exist. Thorne looked at the imposing entrance to the kill house, a dark maw of concrete and steel. He took in its dimensions, his gaze lingering for a fraction of a second. Then he turned his head back to Miller. The silence stretched, taut, and electric. Finally, he spoke. His voice was raspy and used, but clear as a bell. "Understood." That single word, delivered without a hint of emotion or protest, was a spark in a tinderbox. It was the calm acceptance of a challenge, the quiet agreement to the terms of his own humiliation. To Miller, it was the final, infuriating proof of the old man's foolishness. He smirked, turned to the control booth, and keyed his microphone. The game was on. The entrance to the Serpent's Tooth loomed like the gateway to some brutalist hell. The air inside, even from a distance, felt cooler, stale, and smelled of spent gunpowder and chipped concrete. The other Marines backed away, giving Thorne a wide berth, their anticipation a palpable thing. They were spectators at a coliseum, waiting for the lion to be released. In the glass-walled control room overlooking the course, Gunnery Sergeant Miller settled into his command chair, a smug grin plastered on his face. He toggled the intercom. "On your time, Master Chief." His voice boomed through the external speakers, dripping with mock encouragement. "Try not to break a hip." Thorne ignored him. He was no longer in their world. He was in his own, a bubble of pure, focused intent. His preparation was a silent, meticulous ritual that baffled the onlookers. It was not the high-energy, adrenaline-fueled prep they were used to, no chest-thumping, no loud, motivating shouts. It was the slow, deliberate process of a man who had done this a million times before, where survival depended not on speed, but on the flawless execution of 1,000 tiny, perfect details. He checked the tension of his sling, running his thumb along the nylon, ensuring it would provide the exact amount of counterpressure he required. He adjusted his plate carrier, a minute shift of his shoulders settling the armor into a groove worn by years of service. He rocked back and forth on the balls of his feet, feeling the balance, the connection between his body and the earth. He brought his rifle up to his shoulder, closed his eyes, and held it there for a full 10 seconds. It wasn't a pose. It was a calibration. He was marrying the weapon to his body, making it an extension of his will. The young Marines exchanged confused glances. This was not the explosive energy of a door kicker. This was the patient deliberation of a watchmaker. In the control room, Miller scoffed. "What is he doing? Meditating? Take your time, Grandpa." The targets aren't going anywhere, but as Miller was about to key the mic again to hurl another insult, a cascade of warning lights flashed across his control panel. A high-pitched alarm blared for a second before dying with a sickening fizz. The main monitors, showing multiple camera angles inside the kill house, flickered and went black. An electrical surge, a one-in-a-million fluke from the desert heat overloading an old transformer, had just fried the primary control system. A young corporal frantically typed at a dead keyboard. "Gunny, the system's down. I've lost control of the targets, the lighting, everything." The lights inside the Serpent's Tooth, which were meant to simulate a daytime environment, flickered violently and then extinguished, plunging the entire structure into absolute, impenetrable darkness. Worse, the safety protocols that prevented targets from appearing in physically impossible or dangerous locations were now offline. The Serpent's Tooth was no longer a simulation. It had just become a live, unpredictable, three-dimensional puzzle box in the pitch black, and an armed man was standing at its entrance. The standard operating procedure was immediate, unequivocal. Abort the drill. Abort! Abort! Miller yelled into the dead comm system. "Somebody get on the bullhorn and tell him to stand down." But before anyone could move, a calm, steady voice crackled over a secondary, battery-powered comm channel, a channel no one had even remembered was active. It was Thorn. Comms checked. The corporal, startled, fumbled for the receiver. "Master Chief, we have a catastrophic system failure. The drill is aborted. I repeat, the drill is aborted. Do not enter the structure." There was a brief pause, filled only by the faint hiss of static. Then, Thorn's voice returned, devoid of any alarm or hesitation, as calm as if he were ordering a cup of coffee. "Continuing the evolution." And with that, he melted into the blackness of the doorway. The control room was a scene of controlled chaos. Miller was shouting orders, the corporal was trying to reboot a dead system, and Colonel Vance, who had calmly walked in moments before the failure, stood silently, his eyes fixed on the few grainy, auxiliary camera feeds that were still active. These were the low-light, infrared cameras designed for maintenance and security, not for tactical observation. They provided a ghostly, black-and-white view of the kill house interior, a world of shifting shadows and ethereal forms. Into this spectral landscape stepped Elias Thorn. He didn't rush. He didn't hesitate. He flowed into the darkness like water, his silhouette merging with the shadows. The Marines watching on the monitors leaned in, their breath held in a collective, silent gasp. This was no longer a drill to be mocked. It was a terrifying, real-time event. They expected to see confusion, to hear the sounds of a man stumbling in the dark, bumping into walls, disoriented by the sudden blindness. They saw none of it. Thorn moved with a preternatural awareness, his steps sure and silent on the concrete floor. It was as if he possessed a mental blueprint of the building, or perhaps he could see in a spectrum beyond their comprehension. The first sound came less than 3 seconds after he entered. Thump thump, the distinct, soft cough of a suppressed rifle firing a controlled pair. On one of the monitors, a vaguely man-shaped steel target, which had popped up from behind a corner where no target was supposed to be, fell with a distant clang. Miller stared, his mind refusing to process what he was seeing. How could he have known it was there? Thump thump, clang. Another one, this time in a darkened hallway to his left. He hadn't swept left with his rifle light because he didn't have one on. He hadn't needed to. He was moving through the space, processing threats from all directions simultaneously. He moved not with his eyes, but with something deeper, an instinct honed by decades of operating in the world's darkest corners. On the screen, they watched him navigate the labyrinth. He didn't slice corners the way they were taught in basic training. He seemed to flow around them, using the strange geometry of the darkness itself as a form of cover. He was a ghost, a wraith, his movements so fluid and efficient they seemed to defy physics. The cadence of his rifle became a horrifyingly steady rhythm. Thump thump, clang, thump thump, clang. He never fired a third shot. He never missed. He never hit a no-shoot target, the white-painted steel silhouettes representing civilians, which were now interspersed randomly among the threats. He was discriminating between friend and foe in zero visibility at a speed that was barely human. The climax came in the final room, the notorious boardroom scenario. The monitors showed a long table, with multiple hostile and friendly targets designed to pop up in a chaotic sequence. Thorn entered, and for a moment, he was still. Then, in a single explosive burst of action that was over before anyone could fully comprehend it, the room was cleared. Thump thump, thump thump, thump thump. 3 hostiles, one of which was cleverly hidden behind a no-shoot target, were all neutralized in under 2 seconds. He had engaged the final target by shooting through the soft cover of a chair, a feat of instinct and ballistic knowledge that was simply not part of any training manual. A moment later, his silhouette appeared at the exit on the far side of the building, stepping back out into the blinding desert sun. He hadn't been running. He hadn't even looked winded. He had simply walked through the darkness, solving a lethal problem. In the control room, a young Marine pointed a trembling finger at the large digital mission timer on the wall. It was running on its own independent battery. It had frozen the moment Thorn crossed the exit threshold. 241 seconds. Less than half the record. A dead, suffocating silence filled the room. Miller stood frozen, his jaw hanging open, his face pale with shock and a dawning, terrible understanding. His voice was a choked whisper. "That's not possible." Colonel Vance's voice, when it came, was like the crack of a glacier. It was cold, hard, and carried an immense, unstoppable weight that shattered the stunned silence in the control room. He didn't shout. He didn't need to. His authority was absolute, his fury a palpable force. "Corporal," he said, his eyes never leaving the ghostly image of Thorn on the monitor, "get me that man's service record. All of it. I don't care what clearance you have to use." The corporal jolted from his stupor, fumbled with a secure terminal, his fingers flying across the keyboard. Miller remained a statue of disbelief, his mind replaying the impossible sequence of events over and over. Down on the range, the young Marines were in a state of collective shock. They watched as Thorn, now back in the harsh sunlight, methodically unloaded his rifle, cleared the chamber, and placed it on safe. He moved with the same unhurried pace as before, as if what he had just done was no more significant than cleaning his boots. It was this utter lack of triumph, this profound absence of ego, that was perhaps the most unsettling thing of all. He wasn't celebrating. He wasn't even looking for acknowledgement. He had simply performed a task to its conclusion. Colonel Vance walked out of the control room and down the metal steps to the range floor, his boots clanging with heavy, deliberate purpose. The Marines parted before him like water. He walked past them, past the humbled gunnery Sergeant Miller, and stopped a respectful distance from Thorn. Just then, the corporal from the control room ran up, holding a hardened military tablet, his face ashen. He handed it to Vance. The screen glowed, illuminating the colonel's stern features. And then the truth began to unfold. The narrator's voice, speaking the cold, hard facts from the screen, would have been a litany of impossibilities. Name, Elias Thorn. Rank, Master Chief Petty Officer. Unit, classified. A long string of acronyms followed, but one stood out, a name spoken only in whispers, a designation that was itself a myth. Naval Special Warfare Development Group. DevGru. The elite of the elite. SEAL Team 6. The screen scrolled. A list of qualifications, each one representing years of grueling, inhuman training. Master Breacher. Master Sniper. Maritime Interdiction Spécialiste. Lead instructor for advanced close-quarters combat. The irony was a physical blow. Experimental tactics advisor. He didn't just follow the doctrine, he wrote it. Then came the operational history. It was a sea of black ink. Entire missions, entire years were redacted, hidden behind the highest levels of classification. But the fragments that were visible told a staggering story. Operation names that had never been made public. Locations in countries where the United States was not officially at war. A list of awards that read like a fantasy. A Navy Cross, the second highest award for valor, with a citation that was completely blacked out. A Silver Star. 5 Bronze Stars, each with the small bronze V for Valor device. Multiple purple hearts, a quiet testament to the price he had paid. The last entry was a simple notation: status, active duty, senior enlisted advisor to SOCM. He wasn't an observer. He was there to evaluate them. Colonel Vance slowly looked up from the tablet, his face a mask of awe and profound respect. The old man in the faded gear was not a relic. He was a living legend. He was one of the quiet, unseen men who moved the levers of history in the shadows, a man whose real story could never be told. And they had just mocked him. The full weight of the revelation settled upon Colonel Vance. He held the tablet in his hand, not as a piece of technology, but as a sacred text, the testament of a warrior prophet who had just walked among them. He looked at Thorn, who was now wiping down his rifle with a small, oil-stained cloth, his attention fully absorbed in the simple, grounding task. He was oblivious, or perhaps indifferent, to the storm of realization swirling around him. Vance took a deep, steadying breath. He was a Marine colonel, a man who had commanded battalions, a man who expected and received deference from everyone he met. But in that moment, the rigid structures of rank and service branch dissolved, replaced by a more ancient, more fundamental hierarchy, the one that exists between warriors. He walked forward, his steps precise, and came to a halt exactly 3 paces in front of Thorn. He drew himself up to his full height, his back ramrod straight, his posture a textbook example of military bearing. Then, in a gesture that sent a shock wave through the assembled Marines, he rendered the slowest, most deliberate, most respectful salute of his entire career. His hand sliced through the air, stopped, and held, his fingers perfectly aligned, his gaze locked on Thorn. Master Chief Thorn. Vance's voice was low, formal, and imbued with a reverence that bordered on awe. "It is an honor, sir." The use of the word sir from a full-bird colonel to an enlisted sailor was the verbal equivalent of bending a knee. It was the ultimate acknowledgement of expertise and sacrifice, a recognition that true authority is not conferred by rank, but earned in blood and darkness. Thorn paused his work. He looked up, his eyes meeting Vance's. He simply nodded, then returned the salute with a clean, economical motion. "Colonel." Vance held his salute for a moment longer before crisply dropping his hand. He then turned, his face a thunderhead of controlled fury, to face the crowd of onlookers. He held up the tablet for all to see. "You see this?" he roared, his voice now the booming instrument of command they all knew. "You see this record? This man has more time in active combat than your entire squad has time in the Marine Corps. He has forgotten more about close-quarters battle than any of you will ever learn." He took a step towards the still frozen Gunnery Sergeant Miller. "Gunnery Sergeant," he began, his voice dropping to a dangerously quiet level. "You run an excellent training program. You build hard, aggressive Marines. But you have committed the single most unforgivable sin of a leader. You allowed your arrogance to blind you to the wisdom standing right in front of you." He jabbed a finger toward Thorn. "This man is not an old-timer. He is the reason we have the tactics that keep young Marines like you alive." The record he just broke? He probably set the original standards it was based on 20 years ago. Using iron sights and a flashlight taped to his rifle, Vance swept his gaze across the faces of every young Marine, his eyes burning into them. "You asked this man if he was ready to die. The truth you are all too young and too ignorant to understand is that men like Master Chief Thorn live in a constant state of readiness. They live on a different plane of existence, in the shadows, so that you can stand here in the sun and have the luxury of your ignorant assumptions. Let this be the single greatest lesson you ever learn. The most dangerous man in any room is never the loudest. He is the one who listens, who watches, and who has nothing to prove." Lesson over. The story of what happened at the Serpent's Tooth did not just spread, it detonated. It moved through the barracks of 29 Palms with the speed of a desert wildfire, transmitted in hushed, awestruck tones. It jumped from enlisted mess to the officers' club, from the motor pool to the armory. Within hours, every Marine on the base knew. Within a day, the legend had reached Camp Pendleton. Within a week, It was being told in hushed whispers on encrypted networks by operators in places like Bragg and Coronado. As with all such legends, the details began to morph and magnify with each telling. Some said Thorn had cleared the course blindfolded. Others swore he had done it with only a pistol. A particularly popular version claimed that he had never fired a shot, but had instead disabled all the targets with his bare hands in the dark. The embellishments didn't matter. The core truth of the story was what resonated. A quiet, unassuming master had humbled a loud, arrogant gatekeeper, and he had done it not with words, but with a display of undeniable, transcendent competence. For Gunnery Sergeant Miller, the fallout was both professional and deeply personal. He received a formal, written reprimand from Colonel Vance, a black mark on an otherwise stellar record. But that was nothing compared to the internal reckoning. The foundation of his identity, his confidence, his authority, his expertise, had been shattered in 241 seconds. For days, he was a ghost, performing his duties with a mechanical emptiness. The booming voice was gone, replaced by a quiet, haunted introspection. Finally, he knew what he had to do. He found Thorn late one night, alone in a small, dusty workshop, meticulously disassembling and cleaning his rifle under the stark light of a single bare bulb. Miller stood in the doorway for a full minute, wrestling with his pride. He had come to apologize, but the words felt cheap, inadequate. Thorn didn't look up, but spoke as if he'd known Miller was there all along. "Something on your mind, Gunny?" Miller stepped into the light. "Master Chief," he started, his voice cracking slightly. "What I did, what I said, there's no excuse. I was arrogant. I was wrong. I'm sorry." He had expected a lecture, a dismissal, perhaps even a quiet, "I told you so." He got none of it. Thorn continued his work, wiping a bolt carrier group with a cloth until it gleamed. He paused, looked at the perfectly machined piece of steel in his hands, and then looked at Miller. "Assumptions are heavy, Gunny," Thorn said, his voice calm and even. "They're extra weight you don't need on an infill. Travel light." He then went back to his work. That was it. No condemnation, no absolution. Just a simple, profound piece of operational wisdom that cut straight to the heart of Miller's failure. It was an act of grace, and it was more transformative than any punishment could ever be. The next day, someone used a stencil and a can of spray paint to unofficially rename the entrance to the kill house. In stark white letters above the door, it now read, "Thorn's Alley." The name stuck. It became a new piece of the base's folklore, a reminder that the serpent had been tamed by a ghost. The spray-painted name above the door to the kill house was a temporary, guerrilla act of reverence, but Colonel Vance understood the power of symbols. He knew that for a lesson to endure, it had to be etched into the very culture of the institution. A week after the incident, a work crew arrived at the Serpent's Tooth. They removed the old, official signage and installed a new, polished brass plaque next to the entrance. The engraving was simple, stark, and powerful. It read, "Thorn's Alley, in honor of MCPO Elias Thorn, USN. Record time, 241 seconds, lights out. Let his example be your guide." Competence is quiet. The installation of the plaque was a formal acknowledgement, cementing the legend into the permanent history of the base. But Vance's efforts went far beyond mere symbols. He formally requested that Master Chief Thorn's temporary observation assignment be extended indefinitely, reclassifying him as a senior consultant for the base's entire infantry training curriculum. Thorn, in his typical fashion, accepted with a simple nod. What followed was a quiet revolution. Thorn didn't lecture or hold grand presentations. He simply observed. He would stand at the back of a classroom, silent and motionless, as an instructor taught urban warfare tactics. He would watch from a distance as a squad practiced room-clearing drills. Then he would take one person aside, a young corporal, a new lieutenant, even Gunnery Sergeant Miller, and with a few soft-spoken words or a subtle physical adjustment to a Marine stance, he would completely reframe their understanding of the problem. He taught them to see angles, not just walls. He taught them to listen to the silence between the gunshots. He taught them that true speed came from efficiency and the elimination of all wasted motion, not from frantic energy. His influence was like water seeping into dry ground. It was slow, quiet, but it fundamentally changed the landscape. Gunnery Sergeant Miller became Thorne's most devoted student. The incident had burned away his arrogance, leaving behind a raw, sincere desire to be a better leader. He absorbed every lesson, every quiet correction. His booming voice was replaced by a tone of calm authority. He learned to watch and to listen. He began to judge his Marines not by their swagger, but by the quiet diligence with which they maintained their equipment, by the focus in their eyes, by their ability to perform under pressure without needing an audience. He started using his own story as a cautionary tale for new NCOs. "I once stood right here," he would tell them, pointing to the spot where he had insulted Thorne, "and I was so proud of what I knew that I couldn't see the wisdom standing right in front of me." The loudest man in the room is usually the most insecure. Look for the quiet ones. The real professionals have nothing to prove. Their actions are their resume. The culture of the training facility began to shift, moving away from a celebration of aggressive bravado towards a deeper appreciation for quiet, methodical, absolute competence. The untouchable records set by Thorne became less a number to be beaten and more a philosophical benchmark, a testament to a level of mastery that was the true goal of all their training. A year passed. The sun beat down on the same bleached concrete, but the atmosphere of the training facility was different. A new class of young, eager Marines, fresh from the School of Infantry, stood assembled before Thorne's alley. They were a mixture of nerves and bravado, the raw material from which warriors are forged. They stood before the brass plaque, their eyes reading the legendary words. Their instructor stepped forward to address them. It was Gunnery Sergeant Miller. He was a changed man. The brittle arrogance was gone, replaced by a deep, steady confidence that emanated from a place of hard-won humility. His voice was no longer a parade ground roar, but a clear, authoritative tone that commanded attention without needing to demand it. He didn't carry a clipboard or a swagger stick. He stood with a quiet stillness that was, in its own way, a tribute to the man who had reshaped his life. "Look at that plaque," Miller began, his voice carrying easily in the dry air. "Read the name. Read the time. Most of you have probably heard the stories. They say he was a ghost that he could see in the dark. They say he was the deadliest man to ever walk this base." He paused, letting the myth hang in the air for a moment. "The stories are mostly true, but what the stories don't always tell you is the most important part of the lesson." He then told them the full tale, and he did not spare himself. He described his own ignorance, his condescending words, his foolish pride. He told them how he had judged a man by the age of his gear and the gray in his hair. He recounted the moment of the system failure, the impossible run in the dark, and the crushing, humbling silence that followed. He held up his own failure as a mirror for them to see their own potential for the same sin. "Your goal here is not to beat that time," Miller continued, his voice resonating with deep sincerity. 100 men could try for 100 years and never touch it. Your goal is to understand the mindset that made that time possible. It is a mindset of absolute discipline, of relentless preparation. It's the humility to know that you are never done learning. It's the quiet confidence that comes from mastering your craft so completely that you have nothing to prove to anyone. He swept his gaze over their young faces. "Out here, we're going to strip you of your ego. We're going to teach you that competence is quiet, that professionalism is silent. You will learn that the promises you make in the briefing room are worthless. The only thing that matters is what you can execute under pressure in the dark when everything has gone wrong." That is the legacy of Master Chief Thorne. That is the standard to which you will now be held. The story was no longer just a piece of gossip. It had become doctrine. It was the foundational parable for every Marine who passed through this facility, a permanent lesson in the virtue of quiet professionalism, taught by the very man whose arrogance had prompted the lesson in the first place. The true measure of a legacy is not a plaque on a wall or a story told in a mess hall. It is the continuation of a standard, the quiet transmission of a philosophy from one generation to the next. The real victory that day in the desert was not that Elias Thorne proved one man wrong. It was that his actions created a catalyst for thousands of men to become better. He had not just cleared a building. He had cleared a path for a more profound understanding of what it means to be a warrior. His silent competence had become the new institutional language. From a distance, standing on the observation tower where Colonel Vance had once stood, Thorne watched. He saw Gunnery Sergeant Miller leading the new Marines, his movements precise, his words measured and impactful. He saw the young men listening with a new kind of intensity, their youthful arrogance tempered by a sense of genuine reverence for the task ahead. He saw them touching the brass plaque as they entered the kill house, not for luck, but as a silent acknowledgement of the standard they were striving to meet. Thorne allowed himself a small, almost imperceptible nod. His work here was done. He had planted a seed, and it had taken root in the unforgiving soil of the Mojave. He had repaired a flaw in the culture, not by tearing it down, but by providing a better example to build upon. He turned, his footsteps silent on the metal grating, and walked away from the tower, a solitary figure moving towards the horizon. He sought no credit. He desired no thanks. His reward was in the work itself, in the quiet satisfaction of leaving a place better than he had found it. The world is full of noise, of boasts and brags, of people clamoring for attention, desperate to be seen as important. But true worth, the kind that endures, is not forged in the crucible of public opinion. It is forged in the silent, lonely hours of practice. It is built on a foundation of discipline, humility, and an unwavering commitment to excellence for its own sake. Respect is not something that can be demanded. It is a silent currency earned through demonstrated action. Legacy is not what you shout to the world, but what is whispered in your absence. It is the standard that continues long after you are gone, a quiet ripple of competence spreading outwards, making everything it touches stronger, better, and more true. Elias Thorne was a ghost, a legend, a myth. But the lesson he taught was real, and it would live on in the quiet professionals he inspired, a silent testament to the enduring power of a job well done. For more stories where quiet competence triumphs over loud arrogance, and where silent discipline defines true worth, subscribe to our channel.